Hello everyone, how are you doing? You all good today? So we are carrying on our series in the book of Nehemiah. So we've been going through the book of Nehemiah for about 7 weeks now. We had a slight pause last week when we did the Feast of Tabernacles. Now we're back on Nehemiah. So the chapter we're going to be doing today is pretty much the whole of Nehemiah 6. So if you want, you can get your Bible apps out now or your Bibles. We may be jumping back to Nehemiah 1 a bit, so if you happen to come across it, feel free to put a thumb in it. Now, Nehemiah 6 is a fascinating chapter. It's full of plots and intrigue and scheming and counter reactions to various schemes of intimidation and resistance that Nehemiah receives. And one of the things that I hope to explore today is what happens when we embark on our own great projects. So great project is a term that Nehemiah uses in this chapter that we'll unpick what that means in our lives. But when we start our own great projects, what kind of resistance and intimidation might we receive in our lives, and how might we learn from the way that Nehemiah handles it and be able to apply that in our lives? So that's the plan for today. I should warn you, we go from 0 to 60 pretty quick, so buckle up. But we'll start off with a quick recap of where we've come with Nehemiah. So Nehemiah, all the way back in Nehemiah 1, we met Nehemiah. He was a court official in the court of King Artaxerxes. He was born and educated in Persia, but was of Jewish descent. And whilst he was there, he received news of the state of Jerusalem and Judah, where his ancestral people were. Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Babylonian Empire about 150 years before. And now Jerusalem lay in ruins, not just physical ruins, but spiritual ruins as well. And Nehemiah was deeply moved and grieved by the state that he was in. In that space, he prayed and he fasted and he invited God into that grief, and a plan emerged to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. He took that plan to King Artaxerxes, and to everyone's surprise, including his own, the king not only granted his request that he may have leave to go and embark on this great project, but also gave him military transport and all of the wood that he needed from the king's forest. We then learned that as he went there and allocated the jobs for all of the people so that they may start building the wall with a plan, the various levels of opposition he received and the ways he was able to prepare people to deal with it. And then the final installment that we did on Nehemiah 2 weeks ago with Matthew was about how it wasn't just a physical rebuilding of Jerusalem, but also a spiritual rebuilding, teaching the people to long again for the fear of God, to understand. And so where we pick up the story in Nehemiah 6 is the wall is almost complete. The job is almost done. But there is more resistance and intimidation to come and for Nehemiah to deal with. Now, I want to reframe the story of Nehemiah away from a purely historical tale about an actual city that needed rebuilding. And if we can see instead the whole work of Nehemiah as referring to what happens when we have a sense of something broken in our lives that needs rebuilding. Can we learn from the way that Nehemiah treats this feeling of brokenness, the need to rebuild, and invites God into it? So if we can just jump back quickly to Nehemiah 1. Nehemiah essentially is a book about God who loves rebuilding broken things. Maybe like you, God has placed on your heart a burden for a physical place or a community of people, like the shoebox appeal. Like many of you I know are very concerned about brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. Maybe God has placed that on your heart, and you can definitely read Nehemiah in that lens. But we can also see that Nehemiah is about grieving broken things in our lives, about the process of inviting God into that grief, into that process. And in that, maybe we may have our own great projects of rebuilding in our lives. So when we talk about broken things, I don't mean things that are necessarily in ruins. I mean things that aren't necessarily living up to the glory that we know that they were designed for. Some of us may be in a place of brokenness because of grief over a loss of someone no longer present in our lives, and having to rebuild our sense of identity now that that person is no longer there. Or sometimes we are rebuilding an identity because of a change of career or a relocation to a new place, and we need to rebuild our sense of self. Or maybe the passing of time has meant you are entering into a new season where the old roles that you had, the old spaces you got validation are no longer present, and you need to figure out, who am I? Sometimes the place of brokenness that we're led to is a realization that our lives are not living up to the glory that they were designed for, that we have fallen short of the potential that God has for us. Sometimes our rebuilding is spiritual. Sometimes it is emotional. Sometimes it is physical. Sometimes it is the need to rebuild ourselves when we know that we're not the person that we need to be. And maybe you're all thinking at the moment now of various burdens that God has placed on your heart. Maybe there are aspects of your life where you're feeling like you have fallen short of the glory that God has for you, but you have almost lost the hope that there is possibility of change, that there is possibility of rebuilding. Maybe you've tried to rebuild yourself and failed so many times. Maybe put on your heart is the need to rebuild a relationship, to reconcile an estranged family member. All of these things, we have a God who loves rebuilding things. So when we're in this space, when we're led to this space of realization, the gap between where we are and where we want things to be, Nehemiah lays out a pattern. We can feel that pain, that sorrow, that grief. And in that space, that holy space where we are aware of how far we are fallen short and how much we need God, we can invite God into that pain. We can invite God into that space. Nehemiah prays and he fasts and he waits for a period of time. There is no quick fix. And in that space, we are allowed to feel all of the feelings. No emotion is off limit to God. We can take anger, bitterness, resentment. We can name the realities in our lives and give those to God in that space. And we wait and we pray. And like Nehemiah, eventually, we hope a great project will emerge because we have a God who loves rebuilding broken things. We can see the entire story of the Bible as the story of God crashing down into our world to rebuild something that is broken. Jesus talks about the renewal of all things. Peter talks about the restoration of all things. Paul calls it the reconciliation of all things. We have a God who comes down into our reality through Jesus Christ to restore broken things. We make the mistake sometimes of thinking that our restored lives will only start when we die. They're only brought to completion when we die. The rebuilding and the restoration can start now. The same power that flung stars into the sky, the same power that resurrected someone who was dead for 3 days in Jesus Christ is available to transform our lives now. There is no cycle of addiction that our God cannot break. There is no despair that he cannot triumph over. There are no patterns of behavior beyond him. There is no hopelessness that he cannot breathe hope into. The resurrection power of Jesus is available for us now. So wherever God meets us today, whatever situations and contexts we have in our lives, if there is something broken, if there is a great project that God has placed on your heart, know that God loves rebuilding things. And if we embark on those projects, then we should absolutely expect to find resistance. And by resistance, I don't just mean spiritual resistance, though that is something we need to be aware of. It's very tempting, and I'm guilty of this, to think with our 21st century rational minds that we've surely left the superstition behind, the superstition where we find a devil behind every missed parking space, every unkind word that someone has said. But the Bible is clear that there are forces unseen in our world that are working to thwart our plans, particularly when we're working for God. But sometimes the resistance we will get is not necessarily spiritual. Sometimes it's emotional, and sometimes it's for ourselves. Sometimes it's the lies that say we can never change, that we're not strong enough, that we failed too many times, that our sin is too great, that God will not work with us. We need to name those lies for what they are. And sometimes the resistance we will get are from actual people standing in our way, blocking our path to growth. And that's exactly what Nehemiah encounters at the start of chapter 6. So let's pick up right at the start. We're going to do the first couple of verses in Nehemiah 6. So when word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall and not a gap was left in it, though up until that time I had not set the doors in the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent this message: "Come, let us meet together in one of the villages, the plains of Ono." So we meet our principal three villains of the piece: Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab. They're the baddies. We actually met them earlier on in the chapter. Now, it would be good for us to explore who they are, what their agenda is, and why they're opposing Nehemiah. And maybe their backgrounds will tell us something about the kind of resistance we can expect in our own lives. So Sanballat, also called Sanballat the Horonite, was the governor of Samaria. Samaria was a big region to the north. And when Judah was destroyed and Jerusalem was sacked by the Babylonian Empire, Samaria became the regional powerhouse. It was the administrative center for the region. That was where the Persian politicians were. Not just that, though, but Samaria was situated where the ancient lands of Israel was. So Samaria saw themselves as the continuation of God's people. They'd even built their own temple in Samaria to Yahweh because they believed that their continuity, the right to be called God's people, belonged to them. So we can see why Sanballat would have been incredibly threatened by a rebuilt Jerusalem. Because not only is it rebuilt with Persia's help, so politically it moves the center back to Jerusalem and back to Judah, but also the spiritual reawakening transforms the story back to Judah and away from Samaria. We can see why Sanballat was incredibly threatened by what Nehemiah was doing. And then we have Tobiah the Ammonite. He was an official, a court official from another region to the east called Ammon. And he was, through marriage of himself and his children, deeply interwoven and connected to the noble and priestly rulers in Jerusalem. He had a network of influence. He was working on behalf of another region to exert that influence for his own needs. You can see why a spiritual reawakening would have threatened his network and his power of influence over the area. And Geshem the Arab, it will not surprise you to know that he was from Arabia, representing a powerful confederation of trading nations who relied on a caravan trade route through the region up to Persia and the Mediterranean. It's often known as the incense trail or the frankincense trail. They would pick up the myrrh and the frankincense and they would transport it up and sell it to the Mediterranean. Now this passes through Judah. So a rebuilt and fortified Jerusalem would have the ability to become a trade hub, and that means they can regulate and tax any trade that comes through. Geshem's opposition is entirely about his bottom line. A change to that situation affects his ability to make money and the people he represents. So those are real people with real agendas. But maybe we can look at them as examples of the kind of things that stand in the way of our great projects, our growth. Sanballat represents the power, the structures that benefit from the status quo. that would feel threatened by change and by growth. In our lives, the media, corporations, they don't want us to change because they want to sell us products that can bring us happiness. If we can transform, if we can find our worth and become more the people that God has designed us to be, then we no longer need that product that's going to make us happy. We no longer need that subscription that's going to make us fulfilled. We no longer need to follow all of the trends. There are structures and systems in place to try and tell us that we can't change, or that if we do, we will never succeed. Or there's Tobiah. Tobiah represents those closest to us, the relational pressure. Sometimes when we work on ourselves, when we work on growing, the people most affected are the people closest to us. Because when we grow closer to Jesus, when we work on ourselves, it shines a very painful light on those closest to us who aren't growing. And you will get subtle forms of resistance. And then there's Geshem the Arab. He represents the economic interest. The fact that we love luxuries in our life. We love the easy life. We want change with none of the compromise, none of the hard work. We want the ways to stay exactly as they are because that's easy. So our three baddies hatch a plan. And they say, "Come, let us meet together on one of the villages in the plains of Ono." The plain of Ono was as desolated and as remote as you imagine it would be. It's also on the border of Samaria, which means it is entirely in Sanballat's sphere of influence. This is about as transparent attempt at murder as you can possibly imagine. Come here, Nehemiah, to this desolated spot. Travel by yourself, please. It's quite clearly a plan for him not to return. And then with him out of the way, they can spread lies. Nehemiah's run off. He was corrupt. He didn't have your best interest at heart. This was a transparent attempt to defeat the good work that he was doing. And the first level of opposition we often get is a chance to defeat what we're doing, often before it's even started. Sometimes that comes from within. It's the lies that we tell ourselves that we're not strong enough, that this is foolish, that we forget that we invited God into the process and we started this process with God, but we say, but the outcome isn't guaranteed. Why am I doing this? It's a waste of time. Sometimes defeat is the first thing that the enemy will try. So how does Nehemiah deal with it? He says, he realizes they were scheming to harm me. So I sent messages down to them with this reply: I am carrying on a great project and I cannot go down. Why should the work stop when I leave it to go down to you? I am carrying on a great project. The Hebrew word for great project is this word melacha. It literally means a divine work. It is the phrase that is used in Genesis to describe the work that God did when he created the world. It is a divine work, and I cannot go down. A spiritual project. Nehemiah is reiterating the importance of what he's doing. He is able to remember that this project of his was birthed with God in the center. God is through this project all the way, and it cannot be defeated. It must not be defeated. So when we're faced with defeat, we need to remember, if we have God at the center of our rebuilding, if God has been in our prayers and in our longing for change, then we need to be decisive when the forces are trying to knock us off course. Be decisive. Remember that God is in the center. So they carry on. 4 times they sent me the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. 4 times. Do we think after the first 2 attempts that Sanballat and Geshem expected a different outcome? What are they doing? Because they're not clearly trying to lure him. Like, they can have no expectation that he's suddenly going to go, yeah, okay, I'll go. They're trying to distract him. So if they can't defeat a project, then maybe they can distract away from the focus. Because it's not just the time that Nehemiah would have to invest in replying to these letters, though he would, but the emotional headspace, having to worry about it, having to deal with it, having to worry what their next steps were. The lack of focus and emotional energy that he can put onto his great work. Now, when we think about our modern lives, what ways can we think we might face distraction? What distraction do we have in our modern lives? If I was to travel back in time and meet a couple of medieval peasants and tell them that in the 21st century, in people's pockets and handbags, I would first have to explain what pockets and handbags were. But if I was to explain that in their pockets and handbags, most people in the world have a magical portal that with incantations of their fingers, swipes and taps, they can access the entire knowledge of human civilization up to that point. There is no trivia that is unknowable. There is no rabbit hole that cannot be descended into. But not just that, this magic portal also grants an opportunity to see what our friends are doing, what their thoughts are, what they had for breakfast, what their lives are like, or rather, what they want you to think their lives are like. When we think about our modern lives, there is no better example of how we're distracted than our phones. And there is no stronger example of the grip it has on us than through social networks. By social networks, I mean things like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok. Social networks are increasingly owned by corporations, in some cases billionaires, who are trying to exert their own pressure and influence through the use of their network. But these corporations are profit-making businesses. They need to make money, and that means their algorithms are tuned for one reason and one reason only: to serve you content that keeps you coming back for more. How they do that is they feed you stuff that fires off emotions in your brain. Now, sometimes that can be pictures of your friends getting married or of beautiful puppies. Lovely things. But the importance is the emotions you feel. So they can just as easily get that hit of emotion through serving you outrage and anger and hatred. How many times have you doom scrolled through a social network and seen outrage? I can't believe what that politician who I already hate has done. I can't believe what that group of people are doing. Sometimes we learn to associate boredom with the temporary release and a hit of emotion that social networks and our phones can give. If ever you're in a situation where you have a quiet moment alone on the sofa and you reflexly pull out your phone, or you're at a cafe waiting for a friend who hasn't shown up yet, because we've all got those friends, and the reaction straight away is to pick up your phone, pick it out, have a flick. Sometimes our phones can pull us into places away from the people we're designed to be, the people that God wants us to be. Jesus says in a very famous verse in Matthew 5, 29, 30, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off, throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, if you're like me, your eyes will straight away zero into that word hell, and that's the rabbit hole you'll go down. But this passage particularly, there's a lot of scholarly debate about what that means, whether that means an actual reality in the afterlife or whether it is instead a metaphorical description of spiritual death, of spiritual shame. But what we do know is that Jesus says, if your right eye, which is a fundamentally helpful thing, or your right hand, which is also a good thing to have, but if it causes you to stumble, then maybe it's not a net positive in your life, and you need to consider getting rid of it. Now, I'm not asking you to throw away your phones or get rid of your social networks, though I have myself deleted almost all of my social network accounts this year. But it does mean that we should be intentional about where we're spending our time and our focus. Because the answer to being distracted from our great projects is to be devoted to them. And that means being intentional about where we put our focus. It doesn't mean you can't have the odd indulgence. It doesn't mean you can't have a little bit of distraction. But it means that you are conscious about where you're putting your focus and your energies. Now, if you're feeling convicted, and friends, I don't want to shame anyone here. The phone usage is something that I have struggled with as much as anyone. But if I could recommend this book. It is a great book. It's called How to Break Up with Your Phone. The first half basically explains some of the things it's doing to your brain, like I just said, about firing off emotions. And then the other half is really practical tips about how you can control your phone usage rather than it controlling you. It's not telling you not to use your phone, but to be intentional about how and when you use your phone. So that's how we deal with distraction. So the story carries on. Nehemiah 6 verses 5 will carry on. Then the fifth time, they're persistent, we'll give them that. Fifth time, Sanballat sent his aide with me with the same message, and in his hand was an unsealed letter. Now, before we go into the contents, sometimes when we're reading a Bible passage, we can see a word and we go, that's interesting. Why did they put that detail there? What is important about the fact that it was an unsealed letter? So typically at this time, letters would have been scrolls and they would have been sealed with wax. So you would have put wax down to seal the ends together and pressed it down either with a ring or with a stamp. That was so that the recipient would know that no one else has read the contents of the letter here. So why was this unsealed? Well, it was because Sanballat wanted Nehemiah to believe that other people had read the contents of the letter. Whether other people had read it or not wasn't important. What Sanballat wanted was for Nehemiah to believe that other people had. So we can read the contents of the letter now through that lens. It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it's true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you're building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king, so come, let us meet together. So what Sanballat is doing here is trying to say, hey, this news now is widely disseminated, that everyone's talking about this, that this news is going to get back to King Artaxerxes. Why are they doing that? Well, Nehemiah names it pretty well. They are trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. So if the enemy cannot defeat, if it cannot distract, then maybe it can demoralize. Maybe it can give you fear, despair, hopelessness. Sometimes when we're on our great projects and we start going, what if the outcome is not the one I prayed for? What if the thing that I've been yearning for is not going to happen? What if all of this work is pointless? What if I fail like I failed in everything else before? When these thoughts start taking hold, when the despair starts setting in, we need to think that maybe that is someone trying to demoralize us, to throw us away from the project we're doing. Corrie ten Boom says it more. Worry does not empty tomorrow of its troubles. It empties today of its strength. It's okay to feel despair sometimes. It's okay to feel hopeless. But we need to be aware of the effect it can have on us. The answer is what Nehemiah does. He says, I sent him this reply. Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are making it up out of your head. So the first thing he does is he uses his rational brain to counter the anxious thoughts he's having, to question them, to bring them into the light. Sometimes our deepest fears and anxieties, if we bring them into the light, if we test them and go, is that actually what is happening? And if my worst fears come true, is the outcome as catastrophic as I think it will be? And often when you do that, you realize, the fears can no longer live in the light. Nehemiah is dragging it into the rational world. and dealing with it. And then he prays, now strengthen my hands, because we're not alone in this. When we're demoralized and when we feel despair and when we feel fear, we know that we have a God with us, particularly if the project has started with God at the center. Now strengthen my hands. So we can be determined. We can keep going. When we feel hopeless, we choose hope. When we lose the confidence that the outcome is going to happen, we choose optimism. Now, hear me, and I want to make this really clear. We're talking about momentary moments where we feel a lack of hope and despair. That is very different from persistent feelings of hopelessness and despair. If you are in a space where for many weeks you have been feeling hopeless and despair, or fear that never will subside and leave you, then that is not what we're talking about here. That is not an indication of spiritual attack. That is most likely that you're struggling with a mental illness. If you are struggling in a place where you're feeling despair, that may mean that you're having to deal with something called depression. So depression is something that lies to you. It will tell you that you will never get better, that things will never improve, that you will never have hope. Or maybe you're having persistent fears that just won't leave you. That might be something called anxiety. Both of those things are diagnosable and treatable conditions. When we're talking about being determined and choosing hope and choosing optimism, when you're in the middle of those things, when you're in the grip of anxiety and depression, being determined does not mean keeping going and being a brave face. Being determined in that mode is reaching out to someone closest to you and saying, I am struggling. Or picking up the phone to your GP, making that call you've been putting off. The enemy wants you to believe, if you're in that space, that you will never get better, that you are a drain, that you are just wasting everyone's time. But God has the power to bring you out of that spell. A lot of destructive words have been said to people over the years about people with mental illness, that their suffering is as a result of spiritual attack or sin, or moral failing on their part, that if only they were strong enough, they could pull themselves out. I am not going to add my name to that chorus. Sometimes when you're in the middle of a mental illness like depression or anxiety, you need the help of trained professionals and medication. I have had both. I am proof that you can come through the other side of those spells. There is no shame in reaching out and telling someone if you're struggling. So the story carries on. One day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Deliah, son of Mehetabel, who was shut in at his home. He said, let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they're coming to kill you. So when he says he was shut in at his home, what he means is he's trying to tell Nehemiah that if he leaves the home, he's at the threat of violence. Now, this was normal. We could see this in other places in Nehemiah, that the threat of violence, particularly for people who were helping to rebuild the wall, was real. It was a reality that they had to deal with. That is not out of the ordinary. But his plan is, he says, let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors. What he is laying out is a theological trap for Nehemiah, because Nehemiah will have known, as someone with some Jewish education, that it was not permitted for lay people to go into the inner part of the temple. Only the priestly classes, the Levites, could, and in some cases that was punishable by death. They are banking on the fact that Nehemiah, Persian-born and educated, would not know the scriptures. Why are they doing this? Nehemiah names it. He has been hired to intimidate me so that I would commit a sin by doing this, that they would give me a bad name and discredit me. If you cannot be defeated, if you cannot be distracted, if you cannot be demoralized, then maybe you can be discredited. How many people do we know, prominent Christian leaders or celebrities, who have publicly fallen from their ministry because of some private sin that later emerged? We can all think of examples now of this happening, of people with their own great projects, with brilliant legacies of people's lives transformed. But when private sin becomes public, their ministry becomes discredited, they lose their trust, they lose their ministry, and they leave a wake of destruction around them. Some people here in this church now are still dealing with the after effects of public falling out from ministry in their church communities. The effects can be massive. Sometimes financial sin, sometimes sexual immorality or bullying and intimidation. The more public you are, the more likely you are to face this kind of attack. Because if you can't be defeated, then maybe you can be discredited. So what they are trying to do is discredit Nehemiah in front of other people. But he says, should a man like me run away? Or should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. And I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. Why did he know that God had not sent him? Because he was able to test it with the scriptures that he knew. How do you deal with the threat of discredit? You're disciplined. You keep God at the center of your life. You study the word. You know right from wrong. You do not tolerate little sins that will spiral on top of each other until you end up with something that can discredit and blow up in your face. And it will happen. How do we deal with discredit? We're disciplined. We keep God at the middle. And then as we go through the chapter, we have this little bit here. It says, remember Tobiah and Sanballat, my God, because of what they have done. Now, this is comforting to me in ways you would not believe, as I despair about the state of the world, and particularly some prominent world leaders who seem to be able to get away with anything they want, regardless of the human cost. They can do it with impunity. Remember them, Lord. At some point or other, although they can get away with it now in this life, they will become face to face with their Creator and they will have to justify their actions. That gives me great comfort. And he carries on. Remember also the prophet Noadiah and how she and the rest of the prophets have been trying to intimidate me. Now, Noadiah is mentioned nowhere else in the Bible. This is the only mention we have of her. And we know exactly three things about Noadiah at this point. One, she's called Noadiah. Number two, she is a woman. And number three, she is a prophet or counted amongst the other prophets. Now, this is really interesting to me because in this chapter, Nehemiah's chief skill is discernment, discerning the will of God and the motives of others. And at no point does he think that this is not a normal thing to have a woman with prophetic authority at the time. As we think and as we're involved in conversations and discourse, particularly around our new female Archbishop of Canterbury, we would do well to remember the example of Noadiah and other female characters in the Bible. I know that this is an emotive subject for a lot of people, and we all have to find our balance. But what is interesting here is at no point does Noadiah use her gender to discredit her role. At no point does he call her a so-called prophet or a fake prophet. His issue with her is that she, along with the other prophets, are trying to intimidate him. It's likely that they wanted to take a softer tone with the other regions, that they didn't want to be exclusionary in the way that Nehemiah was, in not inviting the surrounding regions to partake in this rebuilding. But at no point does he call out her gender as a disqualifying reason for why she's providing opposition. And so we end here on this triumphant note. So the wall was completed on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. 52 days to rebuild a wall around an entire city. We had an extension on our house that took over a year. 52 days. And when all of the enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid. They found the fear of God. And they lost their self-confidence because they realized this work had been done with the help of our God. When we're doing our own great projects of transformation and rebuilding, when it seems impossible, maybe people have told us that it is impossible. And when we succeed in our great projects with God at the middle, we can put God on display. We can be a public example to our friends and our family, to the people around us, at the transforming power of God. Let that be a motivation for us when we're feeling weak. That when we succeed, God's glory will be on display, and all of our enemies will be afraid. So as I invite the worship band up and we just summarize what we've learned. When the enemy tries to defeat your great projects, because we will get resistance, let's be decisive. Let's remember that God is at the center of our process. If we've started it right with God in prayer, in waiting, then we can be decisive. If we're being distracted, let's be devoted. Let's focus. Let's make sure we understand and are intentional about where our energy is going, where we're spending our time, where we're spending our focus. It is a currency that we can spend or we can save. If we're facing demoralization, if we're facing moments of despair or hopelessness, be determined, keep going. When I'm doing some physical workouts, I have a little poster next to it which says, "You don't have to feel it to show up. All I have to do is get on the bike in the morning. I don't have to feel it." If we're facing discredit, the answer is to be disciplined, to stay at the heart. And if we do all of that, then let God's power be on display in our lives. Amen.